Okay, so imagine you are sitting in a movie theater in Las Vegas at CinemaCon back in April. The lights go down, and instead of getting the usual polished Hollywood trailer with swelling violins and a slow dramatic zoom, you get deadites doing parkour on rooftops. You get a car chase. You get a boat chase. And somewhere in there, a possessed corpse is running up the side of a bathroom ceiling. That was the first real look at Evil Dead Burn, and the room reportedly lost its mind. Now, if you are a longtime Evil Dead fan, your reaction to that description is probably somewhere between excited and deeply confused, because parkour and boat chases are not exactly what come to mind when someone says Evil Dead. And that confusion is exactly what we are going to dig into today, because Evil Dead Burn is not just a new entry in the franchise. It is a full genre switch. And the history of horror cinema tells us that is either the best idea or the worst idea a franchise can have. So let us break this down properly. Let us go back to 1981. Sam Raimi is a kid from Michigan. He scrapes together about $90,000, drags a cast into the Tennessee woods, and somehow produces one of the most genuinely terrifying low-budget horror films ever made. The Evil Dead is raw. It is relentless. It is the kind of movie that got banned in multiple countries because people thought it was too much. It had no mercy and no comedic relief. It was a pure endurance test from start to finish. And then 6 years later, Raimi made Evil Dead 2. Now here is where things get interesting. Evil Dead 2 is technically a sequel, sort of. It kind of remakes parts of the first film and then continues the story. But tonally, it is a completely different animal. Raimi leaned hard into physical comedy, cartoon logic, and slapstick chaos. The scene where Ash battles his own possessed hand is more Looney Tunes than it is supernatural horror. Critics at the time did not quite know what to do with it. Audiences loved it. Then came Army of Darkness in 1992. By that point, the franchise had basically transformed into a medieval action comedy. Ash goes back in time, fights skeleton warriors, delivers one-liners, and the whole thing feels more like a precursor to The Mummy than a horror movie. It is genuinely fun, but it shares almost no DNA with Raimi's original film. So the franchise went dormant for over 2 decades, and when it came back in 2013 with director Fede Alvarez at the helm, it went completely the other direction. That 2013 Evil Dead reboot was dark. It was brutal. It stripped out every trace of comedy and went back to what made the original so hard to watch. People were genuinely disturbed by it. Critics responded well. It was proof that the franchise could still scare people even after 30 years. Then Lee Cronin came along in 2023 with Evil Dead Rise, and once again the formula changed. Cronin took the setting out of the woods and dropped it into a Los Angeles apartment building. He added more humor, he added family trauma as a core theme, and he still managed to make one of the most viscerally upsetting horror films of that decade. The cheese grater scene alone earned its place in horror history. The point is, this franchise has never had a consistent identity. It has been a pure horror film, a slapstick comedy, a medieval adventure, a grim reboot, and a darkly funny urban siege story. The only real constant is the deadites and the body count. Which brings us to what Sebastien Vanicek is doing with Evil Dead Burn. Before we talk about what Burn is doing, let us talk about who is behind it. Because Sebastien Vanicek is not a random hire. He is a French filmmaker whose debut feature was called Infested, or Vermins in French. The premise sounds simple on paper. Venomous spiders take over a crumbling apartment building. But the execution was something else entirely. The film won Best Picture and Best Director at Fantastic Fest in North America. It got a special jury prize at the Sitges Film Festival. It was the kind of debut that makes the entire horror community sit up and take notice. Sam Raimi saw Infested, and Raimi personally selected Vanicek to direct Evil Dead Burn. That is not a small thing. Raimi is protective of this franchise. He did not just hand it to anyone. He handed it to someone who had already proven they could work with claustrophobic settings, escalating tension, and creatures that feel genuinely threatening. And then Vanicek said something in an early interview that tells you everything about his mindset going into this project. He said, and I am paraphrasing here, that he wanted to make a James Cameron move on Evil Dead the way Cameron made Aliens. Meaning he did not want to copy what came before. He wanted to take the existing universe and put his own unmistakable stamp on it. If you know your film history, that comparison has teeth. Ridley Scott made Alien in 1979 as a slow, claustrophobic, gothic science fiction horror film. James Cameron came along in 1986 and turned the sequel into an action movie, and Aliens is considered one of the greatest sequels ever made. Cameron did not betray the source material. He changed the genre while keeping the core threat alive. Vanicek is attempting the same maneuver, except instead of xenomorphs, he is working with deadites. He has also described his goal with Evil Dead Burn as wanting the audience to feel physically drained when they walk out of the theater. He used the phrase visceral sensory experience. He wants people to feel like they have been through something, not just watched something. That is a very specific kind of ambition. And it is the right kind of ambition for this franchise. Let us talk about what we know from the footage that is out there. The plot follows a woman who has recently lost her husband. She goes to stay with her in-laws at their secluded family home to grieve. And then one by one, the family starts turning into deadites. The tagline is, "Family is the root of all evil," which is honestly a great horror movie tagline. Now that setup sounds fairly traditional for Evil Dead. Isolated location, people you care about turning against each other, supernatural possession at the center of it all. But then you watch the trailer. There are fight sequences in that trailer that look like they belong in a completely different film. The kind of choreography you associate with the Raid franchise out of Indonesia. Clean, brutal, technically impressive hand-to-hand combat. There are chase sequences, a car chase, a boat chase, deadites moving in ways that feel more like action movie villains than traditional horror monsters, running on rooftops, scaling walls, climbing across ceilings. And then there is a moment where a deadite grins and slowly swallows hot candle wax. And that one shot reminds you immediately that this is still Evil Dead. The horror is still there. The gore is still there. There is apparently a finger-severing scene that people who saw it at CinemaCon are still talking about. So the question is not whether Burn is an action horror film. The answer to that is clearly yes. The real question is whether it can pull off what so few films in that genre have managed to do: stay scary while also being exciting. Let us be honest about something. Action horror has a terrible reputation, and not without reason. Think about the early 2000s run of action horror films. 13 Ghosts, Ghosts of Mars. The 2005 Doom adaptation, House of the Dead, the entire Underworld series, Van Helsing, Alone in the Dark, Priest. Most of these films shared the same flaw: they were so obsessed with staging exciting set pieces that they forgot to be scary. The monster stopped being terrifying and became obstacles for the protagonist to punch through. The tension evaporated every time someone did something cool. Critics absolutely hammered these films. The consistent complaint was that action and horror work against each other at a fundamental level. Horror needs uncertainty. You need to feel like the protagonist might lose. Action movies are built on the implicit understanding that the hero will probably survive long enough to have another fight scene. When you combine the two, the action tends to win and the horror bleeds out. There are exceptions. The 2004 Dawn of the Dead remake moved fast, had genuine action sequences, and was still terrifying because it respected the threat level of its monsters. The original Wreck from 2007 was frantically paced and felt like an action film at times, but never stopped being one of the most frightening horror movies of its decade. From Dusk Till Dawn blended genres in a way that felt genuinely surprising and entertaining, even if it leaned more toward fun than fear. But those examples are the minority. The genre's track record is not great. Here is the other thing worth noting though. We are in a different era now. The Resident Evil reboot, directed by Zach Kreger, the same guy behind the excellent horror film Barbarian, is being co-written by Shay Hatton, who worked on John Wick. That is a horror director and an action writer collaborating on a franchise adaptation. The industry is clearly interested in action horror as a serious genre right now, not just a cash grab. And the people being hired to make these films are not people who are going to let the horror component become an afterthought. Here is the case for optimism, and it is a strong one. First, look at who greenlit this. Sam Raimi produced it. Rob Tappert, who has been producing Evil Dead movies since the beginning, is on board. Bruce Campbell is an executive producer. Lee Cronin, who directed Rise, is also an executive producer. This is not a situation where the franchise was handed off to a studio committee that just wanted a recognizable title on a summer release. The people who built this franchise are still in the room, still watching what happens to it. Second, look at what Vanicek has already done. Infested proved he understands spatial horror. He knows how to make a confined environment feel like a trap. He knows how to use creature design to create genuine revulsion. These are skills that transfer directly to Evil Dead. The deadites in Burn are apparently as disgusting and unsettling as anything in the previous films. The candle wax scene alone apparently had people covering their eyes at CinemaCon. Third, the franchise has survived every other genre shift it has attempted. Going from pure horror to slapstick comedy in Evil Dead II should have killed the series. Going from that to medieval adventure in Army of Darkness should have made it unrecognizable. Going back to brutal darkness in 2013 should have felt like a betrayal of the comedy era. Switching to an urban setting in 2023 should have removed the claustrophobic woodland atmosphere that defined the original. None of these shifts killed the franchise. Every single one of them worked because the filmmakers committed to the change fully while keeping the core threat, the deadites, the possession, the survival, intact. Adding action movie choreography to that formula is a big swing. But this franchise has made bigger swings before and come out the other side with critical acclaim. And then there is the James Cameron angle again. Aliens is the template here. That film took an iconic horror franchise, added military action, increased the scale dramatically, and somehow made something that horror fans and action fans both consider a masterpiece. The key was that Cameron never let the action make the xenomorphs feel safe or manageable. They were still overwhelming, still terrifying. the Marines still died horribly. The action just gave the film a different texture and a different rhythm. If Vanicek has achieved something similar, if the Deadites in Burn are still genuinely threatening even when the protagonist is staging impressive fight sequences against them, then Evil Dead Burn could end up being one of the most distinctive entries in the entire franchise. There is one more thing worth flagging here because it connects to the bigger picture. Evil Dead Burn is not the only Evil Dead film in development. There is already a 7th film in the works, currently titled Evil Dead Wrath, which is scheduled for 2028 and is being written and directed by Francis Gallipi. This franchise is not slowing down, it is expanding. What that means is that Burn is essentially an experiment that will shape the direction of the entire series going forward. If it works, if it proves that Evil Dead can function as action horror while maintaining its identity, then every film that follows will have a wider palette to work with. Deadites as action movie villains becomes a legitimate option alongside Deadites as pure horror threats. If it does not work, if the action overwhelms the horror and the film ends up feeling like a lesser version of something from 2003, then the franchise will probably correct course again with Wrath and return to more traditional horror territory. But based on everything available right now, the signs are pointing toward this working. The director has the right instincts. The studio has the right people supervising. The trailer has both genuinely scary moments and genuinely exciting ones. The concept is bold without being reckless. Evil Dead Burn hits theaters in the United States on July 10, 2026, so here is where I land on this. The Evil Dead franchise has spent 45 years proving that it does not have a fixed identity. It is not a franchise built around a consistent tone or a specific aesthetic. It is built around an idea, the Deadites, the Necronomicon, demonic possession, and people fighting desperately to survive something they cannot fully understand. That idea is sturdy enough to survive another genre shift. And Vanicek has earned enough trust from Sam Raimi, from the horror community, from festival audiences, that his version of a genre shift deserves a real chance. I will be there on opening weekend. I recommend you are too. If you found this breakdown useful, consider sharing it with someone who either loves this franchise or thinks action horror is always a disaster. Both groups need to see this film. And I will see you in the next one.